Thank you, James, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to have this opportunity to talk to you about the 1897 surcharge issues, not least because they are a difficult series to study and generally they've been underreported in the literature. Even in the early periodicals and catalogues, there's many uncertain details documented, and consequently that's led to confusion both back then but also now in present day catalogues. We can't really consider the 1897 surcharges without also looking at the forgeries and the reprints that also exist. Many forgeries exist. I've noted over 150 types, and most of these are not previously documented. These forgeries include what are often called reprints, which here refer to either favors or forgeries that have used the original hand stamps as opposed to having used a forged hand stamp. Those catalogues and articles that do actually mention reprints are often confused. They often include lists of forgeries as well as the preprints. Also, the reprints are described as having a violet black ink, and this we will look at a bit later. This is not typically the case. So yes, the forgeries, the reprints, and the postal issues surrounded by confusion. So let's perhaps start at the beginning. Why did we need the surcharge? Well, it appears that there was a shortage in certain denominations. And here we have a report in October of that year with a correspondence from a London philatelist indicates that certain values had become exhausted and the obsolete values were surcharged. The following month, there's a bit more explanation was provided as to why this was necessary, and it's explained because of the stamps, the obsolete stamps from the previous years, say for example the 1892 or 1894 years, were effectively withdrawn for use and were no longer valid for postage. Therefore, a surcharge was needed to bring them back into postal use. And that's exactly what this surcharge states. It says it's authorized for postage 1897. Now, before we look further into the surcharges, it's perhaps worth looking at these two statements a bit more. You know, from the record, can we identify that the stamps had become exhausted? And this second statement about the stamps being withdrawn from use, what can we tell? So here we have the 5-cent issue. And here I've tried to pull out examples where we can find dated cancels on each of the issues. Now, as the previous statements suggested, here we don't find any of the 1892 or 1894 issues with 1896 cancels. In 1896, there were two issues, a violet brown and a blue green. If we look at the numbers that were issued, these were quite considerably less than had been issued in the previous releases. And that may indicate that there were indeed shortages if insufficient numbers had been produced. For the violet brown, we do find 1896 cancels. I've not come across cancels of 1897. This does not necessarily mean that the stamps weren't used in 1897. I mean, generally finding dated cancels is difficult for all years. For the 5C blue-green, then here it's opposite. The 1896 cancels are not common at all, but we do find some examples of 1897 cancels. It's possible that there was some later batches arrived, perhaps, but as a whole, used examples are scarce, and there are only 30,000 issued of that stamp. Now we have a similar picture for the 15-cent issues. Here, the dated cancels fit nicely in the periods that they were intended for, and with the 1896, we only have one stamp issued. We find 1896 cancels, but we don't find any 1897 cancels. The 15-cent stamp was the registration rate at that time, so there's possibly an increasing demand, and yet that had not been met by an increased number of stamps released. And again, the 20 cents issues show a similar picture, except for here with the 20 cents orange stamp, we have 1896 and 1897 cancels. So we do find stamps which were available at that time. The 20 cents was the double overseas rates to Spain and the colonies, and we know also that in 1897 there was a request for 40 cents and 80 cent stamps to be issued for larger packages. So again, perhaps there was an increasing demand without these stamps, these larger denomination issues. The 20 cent issue had been used at that time. So this little interlude is not conclusive, but it helps sort of paint a picture around the purpose of this, the surcharge stamps. So what other evidence do we have on the availability of stocks? Well, when the American government took over from the Spanish authorities in 1898, the contents of the public warehouses in Manila were turned over. And these included a lot of remaining stamp issues. These eventually came onto the philatelic market, and Schenkel, in one of their various attempts to offload these stamps, offered them as for wholesale purchase. Now, in those lots included the 1896 issues of 5 cents, 15 and 20 cents. So clearly there were still stamps available at that time, although it's noted that these were generally offered only in lots of 100 compared to the other issues which were available by the thousands. So whether those stamps had become lost within the warehouses or just had not been very efficiently distributed amongst the post office is difficult to say. Let us now return to the surcharge stamps themselves. The official date of issue is uncertain. Many catalogues simply record the date to be 1897, and the Spanish catalogues still retain a date of 1898. However, they were first recorded in the magazines and journals at the time, which came out around August 1897. That may well have led Hansiel in his catalogue to suggest a date of June 1897 for the issues. Peter Harraden in his catalogue records March to June 1897, although does not provide an explanation of where that date came from. Don Peterson noted that the majority of the postmarks occurs between October and December 1897, and at that time recorded the earliest postal mark as being the 5th of August. Some 25 years later, Don updated that with a stamp which was postmarked at the 7th of June. That's illustrated here in that bottom left-hand corner. However, since that time, I've noted a couple of stamps which have earlier dates. One, the 15 cent stamp, which has got a date of 30th of March, and then a third stamp which appeared on eBay with a date of 14th of February 1897. I haven't actually seen that last stamp physically. It remains a question as to whether that's a valid postmark or not. However, it's interesting to note that all the early issues have a blue inked surcharge perhaps the blue surcharge stamps were the original issues, early issues. It's not quite certain as to what the different colours represented, whether they represented different periods or whether different uses, for example. So when we try to identify a stamp, we generally turn towards a catalogue. However, here are various illustrations that were provided both at the time when the stamps came out and well, throughout the 20th century and up to the modern day. And all I can say is that these illustrations are not very helpful. Most of them, if not all of them, appear to be forgeries or simply reproduced from line drawings. And in many catalogues, the reproductions are of low quality, very difficult to use. So, yeah, what do we do about that? Well, the answer is that we have to go back to our own collections and examine them carefully. However, in the Madrid Filatelico in October of that year, we find these 3 illustrations of stamps, of the hand stamps. And the report goes on to say that the stamps sent for the surcharging have been scratched to prevent new surcharge stamps from being made. So this is quite an interesting article. Not only does it represent probably the best contemporary illustrations of the surcharges, but it points to some other questions and facts. So were the dies fabricated in Spain and sent to Manila for the purposes of surcharge? The text appears to suggest that, but we have no records of this taking place. It does support the assumption that there was only one type of hand stamp for each value. That's quite useful when we're trying to compare differences. It also suggests by the fact that the dies were destroyed or defaced was that any reprints must have also been created prior to October 1897. In the past, many others have suggested much later dates for the reprints. And the fact that the surcharges were destroyed essentially possibly accounts for the number of forgeries that now exist, because there was no way of creating new stamps to meet demand, for example. Now let's look at the stamps themselves. Now we'll start off quite simply with the 5C blue surcharge on the 5-cent green. Past catalogues often confuse the 5-cent base stamps, either because they don't list the 1892 and 1894 issues as separate, or just because color descriptions have not been consistently used. However, the 5C blue surcharge is found on the 1894 issues, and you can tell this by the gum type. However, the surcharges are often smudged or partial, but occasionally better strikes are found. And importantly, most examples of this stamp are genuine. There are only a very few forgery types, and these are generally scarce. So if you have a 5C blue surcharge on the 5C green, then most likely it is going to be genuine, and you can start to use this to help identify other surcharges as being genuine or not genuine. A similar case is that for the 5C red surcharge, except for now the red surcharge is found on the 1892 issues. So again, you can differentiate those stamps by the gum type. Does the different color surcharge represent different batches of stamp surcharge? We don't know, it's just a question there. Again, the surcharge is typically smudged or partial, but sometimes we do find better strikes. And again, most of these stamps of this issue are genuine. There are only a few forgery types, and these are generally scarce. Again, we can build up our picture of what genuine 5-cent surcharges look like. Now we come on to what is a more challenging stamp, the 5C black surcharge on the 5C green. Bartle suggests that it occurred on the 1894 issue. Palmer, in his catalogue in 1912, suggested it was on the 1896 blue-green and the 1894 issue. However, no recent genuine examples have been seen to verify these details. Even some of the early magazines suggested that the description of this stamp was a fantasy. Galvez, in his Madrid Philatelico, originally reported it, but then said the stamp was reported in error. However, that initial reporting seems to be adopted and has continued throughout magazines and catalogues. Bartels does offer an illustration of a 5C stamp. However, it is not clear as to whether that's a black surcharge or one of the blue or red surcharges. So there still remains some uncertainty over that particular stamp. And I would say most likely those offered for sale will be forgeries, whether that's eBay or to an auction house. And in fact, there are many forgeries of this particular stamp that exist, at least 20 different types, and some of them are very dangerous. In this slide and in future slides, if I've illustrated the stamp with a yellow background, that's generally to indicate that it belongs to a forged variety. One of these stamps is very dangerous, and I've highlighted that in red at the bottom, and this is often found in auction catalogues. Rather ironically, it is one of the stamps that Bartels lists as a forgery at that time. So this is one of the few forgeries that has been recorded, and yet people are still making these mistakes when they're issuing certificates or when they're listing the stamp in a catalogue. In terms of the 15-cent blue surcharge here on the 15 red brown, again, most examples of this stamp are genuine. If you can find good copies, then it's a good reference to use. You will find forgeries. They're most commonly they use black ink, though. We do find what we call the reprints using the genuine hand stamp. They're described as occurring in violet ink, but these are listed as postal issues in some early catalogues, Stanley Gibbons being one of those catalogues. Bartels and Galvez also describe reprints in a violet black ink, and there's also a reprint described to be in a black ink. I've not seen a genuine reprint in black. I've seen forgeries in black, but none which use the genuine hand stamp. These next two stamps I've grouped together because I think it's just convenient to do so, and that's the 15-cent black surcharge and the 15-cent violet surcharge occurring on the 15-cent rose stamp. Now, these are also described as violet black and also violet and black, and often there's a mixture of ink colors noted. Also, sometimes these are described as reprints, especially the mixed colored inks are described as reprints. I'm not totally convinced that they are reprints. Palmer speculated that the violet surcharge may have been caused with accidental striking of the dye upon the black ink while surcharging in red. I find that difficult to to support the evidence that we see. Unfortunately, we do see a number of forgeries of this type, of this 15-cent stamp, and yeah, and they can be difficult to differentiate. However, I think perhaps a better explanation of the range of inks that we see comes from Galvez, who described the two ink types. He described one being the black, a greasy ink, and then he described a black violet ink, which was described as being an aniline ink, that is water soluble. And I think this ink type tends to describe the variations that we see much better than being recorded as double striking on the ink pad. And it results in as noted, quite a range where we just have small amounts of purple or small amounts of violet ink and sometimes dramatic half and halves. It's notable that this particular stamp, there's a common variety illustrated here, which has got this small black ink dot in the corner there, possibly due to some residual material being caught on the hand stamp. So that's another interesting variety that we have of this particular surcharge. If we now move on to the 20-cent surcharges and start with the 20-cent blue surcharge, it's worth noting that Bartels and Palmer both suggest that this stamp this surcharge was made on the 1893 printing. However, all known examples are found on the 1892 printing. That is the stamp which has the generally has the worn base plates and the gum type of that year. Galvez reported that there was only 2,000 stamps issued. Perhaps I would say that this stamp is more commonly found than the number issued suggest. However, there's a very common forgery in blue ink exists, and they probably outnumber the genuine examples. Other forgeries do also exist, but they typically use black ink and so are easier to identify. Again, most of the forgeries that occur still occur on the 1892 printing. There's a very few which occur on the 1893 print. So as mentioned, this is these two stamps here in the center here represent this common forgery that is found. Most typically, it's identified by the shift of the number 7 and the period to the right compared to the genuine stamp. The actual hand stamp itself, it was listed by Bartels, although he did not note it as occurring on the 20-cent grey brown. And just to add confusion is, here we have an example with which has had perhaps a bogus postmark applied to it. Another way to identify this stamp is the color of the surcharge. It tends to have a slightly brighter luster, more of a teal blue color than the genuine, which often has a dull appearance. And not so many years ago, we did see a large block of this appear in one of the auctions. Moving on now to the 20-cent black surcharge on the dark violet issue. Now, Galvez again reports that only 1,400 stamps were issued again, so this stamp's becoming quite scarce. Again, I feel that we probably more commonly find this stamp than that number suggests, but it is scarce and consequently a large number of forgeries and different types of forgeries exist. Bartels and Galvez both report a reprint as occurring. However, I've not actually seen a reprint again, one which is uses the genuine hand stamp. Here's the most common forgery type we see of this stamp, and it's similar to that on the previous slide when we looked at the 20-cent grey brown, except for this is in black, and again this was reported by Bartels. So now we move on to the 20-cent blank surcharge on a different value base stamp. Unusually, it's been placed on the 25-cent brown stamp. Now, numbers are going down. Galvus now only reports only 1,000 stamps have been issued. I would say that I've not seen any genuine examples again to verify these details. This illustration by Bartels does exist in his catalogue. However, it being in black and white, it doesn't preclude it from being one of the reprints possibly. In the records, in the catalogues, inverted, double, sideways surcharges are reported. I think these are very likely to be forgeries and represent the forged examples that I've seen. And again, similar to the 5-cent green the 5-cent black surcharge on the 5-cent green, most likely if you're offered these for sales, that they will be forgeries or reprints. And as I said, many forgeries exist. Here's just a few of them. The one on the left is quite a dangerous one, but often recorded sideways like this, and often accompanied with bogus surcharges. Now let's look at what we call the reprints. Now these are, for want of a better word, forgeries which have used the original genuine hand stamp. Now, in many of the English language catalogues, the color of the surcharge is described as violet black. I think that color is misleading. Not least has it been mistranslated from earlier descriptions from France and Belgium in terms of being described as, which were described as black violet as opposed to the other way around. However, even black violet is perhaps misleading. So we can probably group these stamps into different categories. Firstly, there's a few examples. They're generally quite scarce, and that's these two at the top here, which are reprints on what I call non-standard base stamps. We don't find the genuine postal issues in that combination. In the second row there, we have examples of surcharges which are perhaps been undertaken to mimic the genuine postal issues. So we have 5 cents on the 5-cent stamps and 15-cent surcharge on the 15 cents and so on. Interesting, a few points to perhaps of interest here is that the 5C sort of what I would call violet surcharge, it occurs on the 5-cent blue-green stamp. Now this was one of the stamps which was meant to be in short supply at the time, and the cause for the need for the surcharge. So whether a refresh supply was available, it's difficult to understand that the logic of surcharging this currently a valid stamp. The other stamp to look at is we've looked at before, is this the 15-cent black and violet surcharge on the 15-cent rows. In some catalogues and articles, this is described as a reprint. However, I'm minded that it is not a reprint, and that is actually a postal issue. Not only is the colours different, but we also find this stamp with genuine cancels on them. So I'm going to move that over there and out of our list of reprints. Now, the third group on the bottom here, and this is perhaps where the description of a violet black or a black violet ink has come from, are these three stamps at the bottom, and they all occur on the 25-cent brown. Now, these are potentially have been recorded as occurring on a single sheet, which has been called a trial sheet or a proof, and probably sit separate from the above reprints. So this trial or so-called proof sheet was first described in 1899 as being brought back from Manila by a collector as being one of a kind, and it described a sheet of 25-cent brown stamps which had been surcharged with a mixture of surcharges, a 20-cent, a 15-cent, 5-cent, and also a telegraph surcharge. In a 1948 auction catalogue, it was noted that a photo accompanied a particular lot, but it's noted that this entire sheet had been broken up. So finding that sheet now is well, no longer possible. We only know 4 examples originating from that original sheet, and I've illustrated those 4 examples here. Now, luckily, I've been able to track down that original photograph, and it occurs as a plate within the Madrid Philatelico in 1899, and that's proved very useful because it means that by looking at the position of the perforations and the surcharges, we can position each one of those 4 strips within the sheet and confirm that they are perhaps genuine. Now the top strip on the right hand side there actually is a composite. It appears to have taken stamps from different positions in the original sheet. The other 3 examples are genuine strips, although they've all been reinforced somewhat with hinges on the rear. Now, it's interesting to note that it's quite common to find the 20-cent on the 25-cent stamp in this colored ink. Quite a few occur. Yeah, I've perhaps examined over 50 examples myself. However, none of those examples I can match to a position on this particular sheet, suggesting that there are other sheets that occur perhaps only with the 20-cent surcharges that in existence. At the time, it was reported that this particular sheet was the only one in existence, but there are perhaps other similar sheets which only use the 20-cent surcharges. However, beware of forgeries. Even for this sheet, there are examples of forgeries. Either you might find them as individual stamps, or as I said, 10 block, or here quite a large block, again found at a recent auction, and even accompanied by a certificate of authenticity. And last but not least, in discussing the reprints, is the 5-cent red surcharge on the 1882 issued stamps. It's reported that quite a few, some 30 to 40,000 of these stamps were surcharged by mistake, but were not put into circulation. And they eventually were withdrawn, and they appear to have been sent to America, where they first seemed to appear on the market. Number of catalogues describe these as either mottled red or grey black, and some catalogues issue these as separate stamps. However, from looking at larger blocks, there's a range of colours that occur within an individual block. So I don't think they are separate issues. They've just reflect a natural variation in the ink that was used to surcharge the stamps. Again, it's quite common to find quite good quality surcharges, and so again they can be used as a reference to compare other stamps with. And yes, the forgers continue to try and confuse us, and we find bogus cancels on these stamps as well. Now, these reprints can be found on cover, and this is an intriguing example which came to auction late last year and was part of the Antonio Cuestas collection. It contains a mixture of genuine postal stamps and reprints. On the rear, there's a receiving stamp of the 20th of October. And this cover was probably philatelic because it's addressed to the Duke of Tetuan, who at the time was Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Well, at least up to 4th of October, which is when the cover was sent at that time. Now, I speculate that the reprints have been attached inverted to this cover to indicate that they have a non-postal status. Except perhaps here the sender accidentally inverted the 20-cent blacks on 20-cent violet stamp instead of the dark violet 20-cent surcharge on the 25-cent. So that may well be an explanation without the contents of the letter to help explain the purpose. We don't know. It's perhaps conspicuous by their absence, both the 5C black on the 5C green stamp and also the 20-cent black on the 25-cent brown stamp. So yeah, these two stamps, which are very rare and we haven't seen, they don't appear to have been that available at the time either. So a few tips for identifying the forgeries. I mean, if you get a stamp and it's on an unexpected base stamp, then it's likely to be a forgery. If you get a stamp which has a different ink color compared to the genuine postal issues, again, it's likely to be a forgery. Some of the forgeries have a very crisp impression, so that can give you an indication that it's a forgery. And many of the forgeries comprise inverted or double strikes, so immediately that raises a suspicion. Also, of course, if it's one of these the two scarce stamps, the 5C black on 5C green, then, as I said before, it's most likely to be a forgery. Size has sometimes been used to describe differences in to identify different types of forged hand stamps. In a few examples, that is the case, although I think using measurements can be difficult when you're maybe looking at 0.5 millimeter and the surcharges are smudged or blurred. That's not such a useful guide for most of the forgeries, at least. Now, to also help you identify forgeries, on my website address down the bottom here, I've included some crib sheets which allow you to compare known forgery types, and so they're quite useful, I find, to be able to look at the differences between the different forgeries, but also to positively identify a forged hand stamp rather than just saying that it does not match the genuine example. Now, one of the questions that James often asks is how to go about building a collection. I suppose some tips here, decide whether you want to collect the genuine or whether you want to collect the forgeries or both. Don't be discouraged by the number of forgeries, but you should be aware that they exist, study the information, and then perhaps most importantly, study your collection. The 1897 surcharges is an area where actually your collection is probably more informative than many of the past catalogues and periodicals. Now, there's some varieties that you can collect, mainly of the base stamps. There's various constant flaws, which I've noted on the base stamp, and I know a lot of people like to collect these flaws, but also the surcharge stamps as well. And for example, the 5C blue and the 15C blue surcharges are relatively commonly found. So that does enable you to build up those collections. Other areas to think about are like different postal cancels. If especially the dated ones are quite scarce, but certificate registration cancels are more common. But again, some of the forgeries have cancels, and also, as we've seen, some of the and there's bogus cancels exist. Blocks can be collected, particularly the 5-cent blue and red surcharges. We occasionally see those offered for sale on various sites. I think the main thing to say is don't be discouraged by the forgeries. Some of them are scarcer than the genuine stamps, and many of them are more than 100 years old, so they provide their own interest in themselves. When it comes to covers, I would say that covers are scarce. I'm only aware of about 12 examples, and I would recommend that they potentially can include forgeries, and yeah, so just be careful when you're looking to purchase, and you're lucky enough to be able to purchase a cover with the surcharges on. Briefly, I'll flip up here a list of references that you might want to check. So if you play this recording back, you'll be able to just pause it and look at these references. So thank you all for your attention. It's been quite a whistle-stop tour through the 1897 surcharges. I'd like to just acknowledge Nigel, who lent me his collection for a number of months, which allowed me to compare both our collections, because quite simply the 1897 surcharges are one of those areas where you need to rely on your own collections to draw your conclusions, because the past catalogues and the past papers are not always reliable, and as I say, you need to draw your own conclusions from your own collections. Hopefully some of this work will help you in that endeavor. Now, unfortunately, I can't take any questions from the floor at this time because it's being recorded, but if James takes any questions, I will make every effort to get back and respond to any questions you may have. So before I go, then, just to say, enjoy the rest of your evening.